I'm the author of this book. First of all, can I just ask, is anyone here who doesn't drive? Show of hands. You might want to wait outside. This is my book. It came out about a year ago in hardcover, and it's been very exciting. It's been published in many different languages around the world. And sort of a funny story, the German edition is actually called Auto, and I sort of wondered why they were calling it Traffic, so I called up the publisher in Berlin, and I said, you know, I was curious why I didn't go with the word traffic. I mean, it's not the easiest book in the world to sell, but with that title. He said, well, Tom, in German, the word traffic is actually synonymous with the word for intercourse. So I spent about 5 minutes on the phone explaining why it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing for people to confuse in their minds, but you know, I think we all probably have questions and opinions and things dealing with traffic and driving, so I want to try to keep my section here short and get to your questions, because I spent a lot of time, many years, absorbing a lot of sort of otherwise useless information, but hopefully I can impart some of that to you. So just very briefly, the book began the most inauspicious way on a kind of construction work zone merge on a crowded New Jersey highway, kind of that area that the Sopranos opening is set, and I was driving the same section day after day, and always one of these early mergers. The sign said 2 lanes down to 1, merge right 1 mile. So I always got in this long line of vehicles, and every day I was growing frustrated by the few people who went past me, a mile or so out of view. So one day I became one of these late mergers, and I felt so weird about it, and I started asking friends, and I found this was a great way to get arguments started, especially among married couples for some reason. Was this the wrong thing to do? Was this bad for traffic? Was this good for traffic? Why was this the best system to have set up on the highway? What did this all mean? So I just started looking into it a little bit and uncovered this really sort of deep, fascinating, complex world of traffic engineering. And these problems are not easy to sort out, and 2 lanes merging into 1 is sort of one of the hardest problems out there. So I'm just going to read a few short segments to give you a flavor of the book, and then I would love to just kind of get a little discussion going. The first section. That page carefully folded. Okay, this is sort of from the psychology section. Your daily drive may not seem to have much to do with the strategies of the Cold War, but every time 2 cars approach an unmarked intersection simultaneously, or 4 cars sidle up to a 4-way stop at about the same time, a form of game theory is being applied. Game theory, as defined by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Thomas Schelling, is a process of strategic decision-making that occurs when, as in a nuclear standoff or a stop sign showdown, 2 or more individuals have choices to make, preferences regarding the outcomes, and some knowledge of the choices available to each other and of each other's preferences. The outcome depends on the choices that both of them make, or all of them if there are more than 2. Traffic is filled with these daily moments of impromptu decision-making and brinksmanship. As Schelling has argued, one of the most effective, albeit risky, strategies in game theory involves the use of asymmetry in communication. One driver, like a guy interviewed in Mexico City, where they have a lot of these unmarked 4-way intersections, makes himself unavailable to receive messages and thus cannot be swayed from going first to the intersection. These sorts of tactics can be quite effective if you feel like risking your neck to prove a bit of Cold War strategy. Pedestrians, for example, are told that making eye contact is essential to crossing the street at a marked crosswalk, the kind without traffic lights. But at least one study has shown that drivers were more likely to let pedestrians cross when they did not look at the oncoming car. Drivers at intersections are acting on a complicated set of motives and assumptions that may or may not have anything to do with traffic law. In one study, researchers showed subjects a series of photographs of an intersection toward which 2 vehicles equally distant from the intersection were traveling. One had the legal right-of-way, and the other did not. The second driver also did not know if the first driver would take the right-of-way. Subjects were asked to imagine that they were one of the drivers and predict who would win the right-of-way under a variety of conditions, whether they were making eye contact, whether they were a man or a woman, whether they were driving a truck, a medium-sized car, or a small car. Eye contact mattered hugely in this. When it was made, most subjects thought the driver who had the legal right-of-way would claim it. Drivers were also more likely to yield when the approaching car was the same size. They were even more likely to yield when the driver was female, an artifact, the researchers suggested, of a belief that women drivers were less experienced, competent, or rational. Or was it just chivalry? Traffic is a kind of living laboratory of human interaction, a place thriving with subtle displays of implied power. When a light turns green at an intersection, for example, and the car ahead of another driver has not moved, there is some chance the horn will be sounded. But when that horn will be sounded, for how long, and how many times it will be sounded, who will be sounding the horn, and who the horn will be sounded at are not entirely random variables. These honks follow observed patterns that may or may not figure pre-existing notions. We've already seen that drivers in convertibles with their tops down, less cloaked in anonymity, were less likely to honk than other drivers. For a similar reason, drivers in New York City, surrounded by millions of strangers, are likely to honk more and sooner than a driver in a small town in Idaho, where a car that has not moved might not be a random nuisance, but the stalled vehicle of a friend. What the driver ahead is doing also matters. One study showed that when a car was purposely held as the light changed to green, drivers were more likely to honk more often and for a longer time if the non-moving driver was quite obviously having a cell phone conversation than if they were not. Men, it turned out, were more likely to honk than women, though women were just as likely to visibly express anger. All kinds of other factors, everything from gender to class to driving experience, also come into play. In another classic American study replicated in Australia, the status of the car that did not move was the key determinant. On the testosterone side, men are less likely to wear seatbelts, and by just about every measure, they drive more aggressively. Men do things like ride motorcycles more often than women, an activity that is 22 times more likely to result in a death than driving a car. Male motorcyclists from Vietnam to Greece, United States, are less likely than women to wear a helmet. As we all know, alcohol and testosterone mix in unpleasant ways, so motorcyclists who have not been drinking are less likely to wear helmets than those who have not, just as male drivers who have been drinking are less likely to wear seatbelts than those who are sober. The fact that Fred is divorced puts him in a riskier pool. A French study that looked into the experiences of some 13,000 company employees over 8 years found that a recent divorce or separation was linked to a fourfold increase in the risk of a crash that could be at least partially attributed to the driver. One could hypothesize many reasons. There's the emotional stress, perhaps more drinking, or maybe lifestyle changes like driving more to visit the kids on weekends. Perhaps people who get divorced are simply the type of people who take more risks. Fred might take some comfort, however, from a New Zealand study that found that people who have never been married have an even higher crash risk than those who are divorced. Fred may not have a life partner, but he should be glad if you chose to join him in his truck. Passengers seem to be a life-saving device. Studies from Spain to California have come to the conclusion that a driver has a lower chance of being in a fatal crash if there's a passenger. This holds particularly true for middle-aged drivers, especially when the passenger is a woman and the driver is a man. Whether this stems from men looking out for women or women telling men to drive more safely is open for debate, of course. The exception here is teenage drivers. Teens are less likely to be wearing seatbelts and more likely to be drinking when driving when there are passengers in the car. Many studies have found that teen drivers are more likely to crash with passengers on board, which is why in many places teens are of course restricted from carrying passengers of their own age during the first 2 years of driving. So researchers are beginning to uncover fascinating things about how that risk actually plays out. A study looked at the drivers exiting the parking lot at 10 different high schools and found that teenage drivers seemed to drive faster and follow cars at closer distances than other drivers did. Males more drove more swiftly than females, perhaps a surprise. This is common knowledge verified by insurance rates. But the risk-taking varied. Male drivers drove faster and followed closer when they had a male riding shotgun. When they had a female in the front seat, they actually behaved less riskily, and they were safer still when they drove by themselves. A pattern also held for female drivers. So what seems to be a need to impress in the presence of males turns into a protective impulse when a female passenger, possibly a girlfriend, is in the car, or it could be that the female passenger serves as the voice of reason. The so-called girlfriend effect seems to take root early and persist through later life. And it need not be a romantic partner. The Israeli Defense Forces, in an effort to reduce road deaths for soldiers on leaves, trains female soldiers, which they call angels, to act as calming influence on their male comrades. And so those are just 3 little segments to kind of give you a flavor for all the stuff that's in the book. And I really sort of just like to open to questions and other sorts of things like that. Thank you. Since you all drive, someone must have.
Not so much question, but comment. I mean, I truly think that there are some signs that you see that are not really helpful. For example, now in Westchester, you have all these signs that you have to stop for the pedestrians in the crosswalk. Well, now I find that pedestrians playing chicken with me. So it's, people glaring at me when they're not, that they're not even performing. That's the first thing. So I feel like pedestrians are more dangerous, especially when I'm around. The second thing is, there was a very confusing sign that I saw in the town of Eastchester, which is very popular. Do we have any people from Eastchester here? Okay,
Eastchester.
just one. I don't want to offend anybody, so I apologize. But I was turning a corner, and you know how you get these warnings when there are speed bumps in the road? Well, this sign said speed hump ahead. And I honestly didn't know what to do. I said, should I stop or not? I don't know. It was a very puzzling use of terminology.
In fact, there's almost sort of an Audubon guide worth of different speed bumps and humps and speed tables, which are these really long things that you could actually sort of dine on, and they're sort of like big, and they all have a different geometry, as they call it, and there's a lot of thought that goes into what will get people to slow down without wrecking their transmission, presumably. And that could arguably be good, because it probably made you slow down, which is what they were trying to get you to do. So
there I made you turn and went back and look at it again.
I guess that doubled the risk. Well, yeah, the worst Eastchester, I'm not sure, but the worst drivers are always in the neighboring town, or the neighboring state. That's sort of the rule of America. So New Jersey,
Did your own driving habits change after you did the book?
Absolutely. I was sort of cautious to begin with. I've had my share of, Poughkeepsie, I had to go back up to court because I got such a bad speeding ticket in town. I was driving a German car that only had kilometers per hour. So I had my young indiscretionary period, but and then recently, about 5 months ago, had a baby. So that of course changes things. Another baby on board is another great safety thing. Reminds me of I think it was Obama's comment about driving home from the hospital, or Michelle Obama said about Brock, that no one drives as carefully that moment as driving home from the hospital with their infant. But I've definitely become just more aware of all the. I've just looked at a lot of crash footage and studied perceptual shortcomings that humans have out on the road, sort of strange illusions that seem to bedevil us. Things I didn't really know about. Just one example. In fog, fog's a low visibility environment, right? That's one problem. But another problem is that it's a low contrast environment. You can't really, all the objects kind of blend into one another, and that actually makes you feel like you're driving slower than you really are. And I think this is why we get these chain reaction crashes off on the highway, because people haven't reduced their speed to the extent that they really need to. So, yeah, I just have this constant loop of this information. Quite take the subway whenever possible. And of course, my wife will no longer drive with me in the passenger seat because of statistics. Yes, sir?
Yeah, for those of you who live here in Irvington, back last year I was working as a poll worker in the polling place here in the town hall, which is also used as the town court. When we were there, I happened to come across a piece of paper that showed the upcoming court dockets. And most of them were traffic violations. And I got curious, so I started going down and looking at the QZ and the violations. And the thing that was interesting was that 80% of the speeding violations all had male names. The violations for running red lights and stop signs all had female names. And my own observations here in town, I live here, would confirm that difference between the two sexes. We might use that for a future book.
I'd like to investigate that further, but yeah, that's the sort of question I'd like to, I think we should all try to be amateur kind of traffic anthropologists when we're out there looking around and kind of mining all this data. But the first I've heard of that, I have to say. Of course, I just saw someone pulled over for speeding as I drove in, and I didn't catch the gender, but I didn't speed up there. So, yeah, I'll have to look into that. It's a very interesting observation.
Oh, here.
In the back?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a two-part technology question. Has anyone ever tried to use Easy Pass in an expressway setting to automatically control speed or that equivalent? You know, they know the time you come on and you exit, and they know the time that you exit the highway, so your speed can be calculated. And then that's one question. And do you have any assessment of the kind of currently advertised stopping technology and infrared sensing technology that newer cars are marketing, promoting?
Yeah, very good question. The first thing, in England, for example, they have what they call area-wide traffic calming, which is basically if you have a neighborhood with only a few entry and exit points, they'll have a lot more cameras in the UK, of course, than there are here, which is partially why it's a much safer place to drive. I hate to say, but so if you go in at one point and you come out at a certain point, it's sort of tracked with your license plate, and it'll actually, if you've driven 70 miles an hour through that little cul-de-sac, it will know this technology, and I think that's used on highways. It's not in the U.S. to the extent that I know of, where we haven't really embraced some red light cameras, but not so much speeding cameras. Well, it's coming more, and Arizona is a big place right now. But and then, so the second question was about automatic.
Well, yeah, there's a lot. New automobiles that are marketing both I think there's IR technology for looking through fog for pedestrians, like we talked about, and also automatic stopping if you come up behind a vehicle and breaking down.
Yeah, I think those are all good in the sense that we do have these perceptual. I mean, humans are not so good necessarily at judging, for example, speed and distance of something when it's sort of straight on. So that's why sometimes a vehicle will suddenly seem to loom into view only at the last minute as you're approaching it. And there's always a risk of these things of behavioral adaptation in which people will feel safer, kind of up their aggressive driving. And we've seen this with all kinds of technologies like anti-lock braking, even a third brake light, the so-called chin sill, which stands for center high-mounted stop lamp. We of course didn't used to have that third stop lamp, and when they introduced it, they thought it was going to save X thousands of lives. People were really going to stop in time, but they really had to kind of redo their estimation, and the projected savings are never quite as great as I think. It's not just to close on that point. NHTSA, the federal agency, is saying electronic stability control, which corrects your oversteering and loss of control, is going to save 10,000 lives a year. And I mean, I'm all for ESC, as they call it, but I don't think we're going to see a 1/4 reduction in that. Because once people know it, the more you can sort of feel it, the more you adapt your driving style. And I don't think airbags, for example, have that same effect because you're not really aware of airbags on any given moment. So that's sort of what I absorbed from that.
From listening to the question, when you wrote this book, did you intend to come out as an expert on traffic and what people drive, or was it more an ironic celebration of trivia?
I'm not sure that the two are actually distinct there, but no, I would say that I'm not an expert in traffic. I just talk to a lot of people who are and trying to tell their stories. I think it is sort of a huge area of research that doesn't percolate to the surface very often, partially because they're not good at, engineers in general aren't good at communicating the messages, and there's such sort of a negative affiliate. Like just the word traffic has such a negative connotation, even though in many other contexts, we think it's a good thing. Google, anyone who has a website wants traffic. Stores want traffic, same store traffic. But when you think about traffic on the road, it's bad, even though it doesn't mean congestion necessarily, it's just people going from point A to point B. So I've lost the thread of the conversation. But there is an immense amount of trivia, and unfortunately, I don't know that there's a category for this on Who Wants to Be Millionaire.
Did you do any study of parking?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of stuff about parking that's interesting. One thing, for example, is that they've studied people at shopping malls and looked to see if there was someone waiting for their spot or not. And when someone was waiting, they took longer to vacate the spot. You've heard of said surveys that they would do that. And then in places like New York City, there's just an immense amount of traffic. They stop drivers and interview them. Where are you going? What are you doing? Sometimes upwards of 35 to 40% are simply looking for parking. So when you think about traffic congestion, so there's people who argue that we need to change how we price this and how we set that up. And But there's been all sorts of studies made. Another favorite one was a Walmart in Mississippi, where a guy who studies what they call foraging behavior among animals. How do you look for food? What's the best strategy? He thought that was kind of an interesting relationship to parking and shopping malls. So he studied whether people basically went to the first open spot they saw or circled to look for the best spot. And he basically found that the people who went to the first spot they saw got to the store entrance faster than those who would look for the best spot. So, okay, thank you.